On a gray November morning in 1982, Customs Officer Sarah Bennett stood in her booth at the Peace Bridge crossing between Buffalo, New York, and Fort Erie, Ontario, processing the endless stream of commercial trucks and passenger vehicles that constituted the ordinary flow of cross-border traffic. The wind off Lake Erie carried the smell of snow that would arrive by afternoon, and Sarah pulled her uniform jacket tighter as she waved through a station wagon filled with Canadian shoppers returning home with American purchases. She had no reason to believe that the next car in line, a modest blue Honda Accord with Ontario plates, would lead her into the center of one of the most sophisticated espionage operations ever conducted against the United States. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Sarah Bennett was 34 years old that autumn, a 12-year veteran of the United States Customs Service who had worked the Peace Bridge since 1974. She had started as a customs inspector trainee, fresh out of college, with a degree in criminal justice from the State University of New York at Buffalo, drawn to federal law enforcement by her father's career as an FBI agent in the Detroit field office. Her father, Robert Bennett, had worked organized crime cases during the 1960s and had instilled in Sarah a respect for methodical investigation and attention to detail that she applied to her daily work at one of the busiest border crossings in North America. The Peace Bridge handled approximately 5 million vehicles annually, a constant flow of commerce and tourism between the United States and Canada that represented the peaceful relationship between the two nations. Most crossings were routine, requiring only a cursory check of documents and a few standard questions about citizenship, destination, and goods being transported. Sarah had processed tens of thousands of such crossings, developing an instinct for what constituted normal traveler behavior and what patterns suggested potential problems requiring additional scrutiny. Her training had covered the typical concerns of customs enforcement: smuggling of contraband goods, illegal importation of restricted items, currency violations, and immigration irregularities. She had caught drug smugglers hiding marijuana in false compartments, stopped weapons trafficking, identified stolen vehicles with altered VINs, and detained individuals attempting to enter the country with forged documents. The work was usually mundane, punctuated by occasional moments of genuine law enforcement action that validated the hours of routine processing. What her training had not emphasized, what most customs officers never encountered in entire careers, was the role that border crossings played in counterintelligence operations. In the Cold War operated in shadows, conducted by intelligence services on both sides who moved operatives, information, and resources across international boundaries using methods designed to avoid detection. Border crossings were potentially vulnerable points where deep cover agents might be exposed, where documentation might be checked against databases that revealed inconsistencies, where a trained observer might notice behavioral anomalies that signaled deception. Sarah had attended one classified briefing in 1979 conducted by FBI counterintelligence specialists who explained that Soviet and Eastern Bloc intelligence services actively used the Canadian border for operations against the United States. Canada's proximity, its relatively open immigration policies, and the high volume of legitimate cross-border traffic made it an attractive route for inserting agents or exfiltrating American citizens recruited as spies. The briefing had shown examples of forged documents, described surveillance detection techniques that agents used, and emphasized the importance of reporting any encounters that seemed suspicious, even if no actual violation could be identified. Most customs officers had listened politely and then returned to their primary concerns of drug smuggling and import violations. The statistical likelihood of encountering a Soviet spy at a border crossing seemed remote, almost theoretical. But Sarah's father had taught her that intelligence work was about patience and probability, that most leads went nowhere, but the ones that mattered justified investigating every anomaly. She had filed that briefing away in her memory and remained more alert than most of her colleagues to behavioral patterns that might indicate something beyond ordinary customs violations. The blue Honda Accord pulled up to her booth at 9:47 in the morning. The driver was a man in his early 40s, with dark hair graying at the temples, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a conservative gray suit that suggested business rather than leisure travel. He had the bland, professional appearance of countless businessmen who crossed the border daily for meetings, sales calls, or consultations. Nothing about his appearance triggered any immediate concern. Sarah leaned down to the driver's window, which the man had already rolled down, and delivered her standard opening. "Good morning, sir. Citizenship and destination?" "Canadian citizen," the man replied, his accent unmistakably Canadian, soft vowels and slight elongation of certain words that marked him as likely from Ontario, or perhaps farther west. "I'm traveling to Syracuse for a business meeting. I'll be returning tomorrow." The man handed her his Canadian passport, and Sarah glanced at it while continuing her assessment of the vehicle and its occupant. The passport was issued to David Morrison, born in Toronto in 1940, occupation listed as technical consultant. The photo matched the driver, though the passport itself looked newer than the PSOM. Issue date would suggest, the pages showing almost no wear, despite being supposedly issued 3 years earlier. Most frequent travelers accumulated stamps, visa markings, wear patterns that reflected regular use. This passport looked almost pristine, as though it had spent most of its existence in a drawer. "What type of business are you in, Mr. Morrison?" Sarah asked, her tone conversational, but her attention sharpening slightly. "I work as a consultant for manufacturing firms," the man replied smoothly. "I help companies evaluate and purchase industrial equipment. This trip is to meet with a client interested in metal fabrication machinery." The answer was perfectly reasonable, the kind of cross-border business that happened constantly in the industrial corridor between Ontario and upstate New York. Sarah glanced into the back seat of the Honda and saw a leather briefcase and a small overnight bag, exactly what one would expect for a business trip lasting less than 2 days. The car itself was clean, well-maintained, showing the kind of care that suggested someone who valued reliability over flash. But something bothered Sarah, something she could not immediately identify, but that registered as wrong in the way that only experience and instinct combined could produce. She looked more carefully at David Morrison, studying his hands on the steering wheel, his posture in the driver's seat, the way he maintained eye contact with her, but not in the overly direct manner that sometimes signaled deception. His hands were smooth, uncalloused, the hands of someone who worked in an office rather than with machinery. His watch was a simple Timex, inexpensive and common. His wedding ring was gold, worn thin in a pattern that suggested years of wear. "Do you make this trip frequently?" Sarah asked. "Perhaps once or twice a month," Morrison replied. "I have several clients in the Syracuse area. The drive is easier than flying for such a short distance." Sarah noted that Morrison's breathing was completely steady. His voice showed no signs of stress, and his body language remained relaxed. These were not the behaviors of someone hiding contraband or attempting illegal entry. If anything, he seemed almost too calm, too prepared, as though he had rehearsed this interaction in advance and was now executing a well-practiced script. She looked again at the passport, this time more carefully. The document itself appeared genuine, bearing all the correct security features that Canadian passports contained. The biographical information seemed consistent. The photo was properly embedded. But there was something about the entry stamps that caught her attention. Morrison's passport showed 3 trips to the United States in the past year, all through this same border crossing, all with similar patterns. Entry for 1 or 2 days, return the next day, always weekday travel that matched business trip timing. What bothered Sarah was not what the passport showed, but what it did not show. A technical consultant who traveled regularly for business would typically accumulate more varied travel patterns. Trips to different cities, occasional longer stays for conferences or training, perhaps international travel to inspect equipment or meet with foreign manufacturers. This passport showed only short trips to Syracuse and Albany, nothing else. As though David Morrison's entire professional life consisted of brief visits to upstate New York. Sarah made a decision. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to pull over to secondary inspection. It's just routine additional screening. Please follow the yellow line to the inspection area and wait inside the building." She saw something flicker across Morrison's face, gone so quickly she almost missed it. Not fear exactly, but calculation, a rapid assessment of options and risks. Then his expression smoothed back into polite cooperation. "Of course, officer. Is there a problem?" "Just routine," Sarah repeated, handing back his passport. "Please proceed to secondary." She watched as Morrison pulled forward, following the marked path to the secondary inspection building where vehicles underwent more thorough examination. He moved with no apparent urgency, no attempt to flee or deviate from the directed route. Sarah immediately called her supervisor, Bill Kowalski, a 28-year customs veteran who had seen everything the border could produce and maintained a healthy skepticism about anything that disrupted the flow of traffic without clear justification. "Bill, I've got a Canadian national I sent to secondary," Sarah said. "David Morrison, traveling to Syracuse on business. Something feels off about him." "What kind of off?" Kowalski asked, his tone suggesting he had heard this before and would need more than intuition to justify the delay. "His passport is too clean for someone who claims to travel regularly. His story is consistent, but almost scripted. And he's carrying himself like someone who's prepared for this interaction, not surprised by it." Kowalski sighed. "Sarah, we process 5,000 vehicles a day. Half of them are businessmen going to Syracuse. What specifically is making you suspicious?" "I can't point to one thing," Sarah admitted. "It's a pattern. The passport, the travel history, his demeanor. I think we should run a more thorough check on him." "Fine," Kowalski said. "But if this turns out to be a sales representative from Toronto who's just really good at packing, you're buying coffee for the whole shift." Sarah joined Morrison in the secondary inspection area, where another customs officer, Tom Chen, was already beginning the standard secondary screening process. Morrison had exited his vehicle and stood calmly beside it, his briefcase in hand, showing no signs of agitation or concern. Tom was conducting a visual inspection of the Honda's interior, checking under seats and in the glove compartment for anything that might be concealed. "Mr. Morrison, I need to ask you a few more questions about your travels." "Plans," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook. "Can you provide me with the name and address of the company you're meeting in Syracuse?" Morrison gave her a company name, Precision Metal Works, and an address on the north side of Syracuse. He explained that he had been working with them for 6 months, helping them evaluate potential purchases of stamping equipment from a German manufacturer. The details were specific and delivered with the confidence of someone who knew his subject matter. "And your employer in Canada?" Sarah asked. "Who do you work for?" "I'm an independent consultant," Morrison replied. "I work with multiple clients on a contract basis. I operate as a sole proprietorship, so I don't have a traditional employer." This was another perfectly reasonable answer. Many technical consultants operated independently, especially in specialized fields where expertise was valued over institutional affiliation. But it also meant that Morrison's professional identity was harder to verify, that there would be no corporate HR department to confirm his employment, no established business with a long history that could validate his claims. Sarah excused herself and went to the customs office to make some phone calls. She contacted directory assistants for Syracuse and confirmed that Precision Metalworks existed at the address Morrison had provided. She called the company directly, reached a receptionist, and asked to speak with someone who could confirm a meeting scheduled for that day with David Morrison. After being transferred twice, she spoke with a purchasing manager named Frank Rodriguez, who confirmed that yes, he had a meeting scheduled with David Morrison at 2 o'clock that afternoon to discuss equipment options. This should have satisfied Sarah's concerns. Morrison's story checked out, his documentation appeared legitimate, and his destination was confirmed. By all standard criteria, he was exactly what he claimed to be: a business consultant making a routine cross-border trip. But the nagging sense that something was wrong persisted, amplified rather than diminished by how perfectly everything aligned. She returned to the secondary inspection area where Tom had completed his vehicle search and found nothing suspicious. No contraband, no weapons, no hidden compartments, nothing that would justify detaining Morrison beyond standard questioning. Morrison himself remained calm, checking his watch occasionally, but showing no anger or impatience at the delay. Sarah made a decision that would later be described in FBI reports as demonstrating exceptional instinct and proper application of training. She called her supervisor again and requested permission to photograph Morrison's documents and send them to the FBI for database comparison. Kowalski was reluctant. This was an unusual request that would further delay Morrison and tie up resources for what appeared to be a routine crossing. But Sarah's father had been FBI, and Kowalski knew she understood the distinction between normal customs concerns and potential intelligence matters. "Make it quick," Kowalski said. "We can't hold him indefinitely without cause." Sarah photographed Morrison's passport, his driver's license, and his vehicle registration. She used the customs office fax machine to send the images to the FBI field office in Buffalo, along with a brief note explaining her concerns. It was now 10:35 in the morning, and Morrison had been in secondary inspection for nearly 45 minutes. "Mr. Morrison, we're just completing some routine verification," Sarah told him. "I apologize for the delay. Can you wait in the inspection office while we finalize the paperwork?" Morrison agreed with the same polite cooperation he had shown throughout. He sat in the small waiting area, declined an offer of coffee, and pulled a technical manual from his briefcase to read while he waited. Sarah watched him through the office window, noting that he appeared to be genuinely reading rather than simply turning pages to maintain his cover. His body language remained relaxed, his breathing steady, showing none of the telltale signs of stress or deception that customs officers were trained to recognize. At 11:20, Sarah's phone rang. It was Special Agent Michael Drovak from the FBI Buffalo field office, and the tension in his voice immediately told Sarah that her instincts had been correct. "Officer Bennett," Agent Drovak said, his words coming quickly. "The documents you sent us triggered multiple flags in our database. The passport number belongs to a Canadian national named David Morrison, who died in a car accident in 1978. The identity was either stolen or reconstructed. We need you to detain this individual immediately without alerting him that we've identified the fraudulent documentation. We're sending agents to your location now. They'll be there in approximately 20 minutes. Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. "Understood. What should I tell him?" Tell him there's a problem with the computer system verifying his documentation, that it happens occasionally with the database, and that you need him to wait while it's resolved. Keep him calm, keep him in the waiting area, and do not approach him alone. We don't know if he's armed or what his level of training might be. After hanging up, Sarah informed her supervisor of the FBI's assessment. Kowalski's skepticism vanished immediately, replaced by the professional focus of an officer facing a genuine security situation. He quietly alerted other customs personnel, positioning additional officers near the secondary inspection area without making any obvious show of force that might alarm Morrison or trigger an attempt to flee. Sarah returned to the waiting area, her demeanor carefully neutral. "Mr. Morrison, we're experiencing some technical difficulties with our verification system. It's taking longer than expected to process your documents. I need you to remain here while we resolve the issue." Morrison looked up from his technical manual. And for the first time, Sarah saw something change in his expression. It was subtle, a slight tightening around his eyes, a fractional shift in posture that suggested he understood this was no longer routine delay. He was assessing, calculating, deciding how to respond to a situation that had moved beyond his prepared scenarios. "How much longer will this take?" Morrison asked, his voice still calm but with an edge of concern that had been absent before. "I'm not certain," Sarah replied. "Hopefully not too long. Can I get you some water or coffee while you wait?" "I'm fine," Morrison said, "but I do have a meeting in Syracuse that I cannot miss. Is there any way to expedite this?" "We're doing our best, sir. I appreciate your patience." Sarah withdrew to the office, maintaining visual contact with Morrison through the window. She could see him sitting motionless, no longer pretending to read, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze fixed on some middle distance as though he were conducting his own internal calculations. She wondered who he really was, what his true purpose had been, whether he understood that his carefully constructed identity had just collapsed. The FBI agents arrived at 11:42, two men in dark suits who entered through the customs office and immediately conferred with Kowalski and Sarah. Special Agent Michael Drovak was in his early 40s with the confident bearing of someone who had conducted hundreds of arrests. Special Agent Patricia Nolan was younger, perhaps 30, with sharp eyes that immediately focused on Morrison through the window. "The identity he's using belongs to a deceased Canadian national," Drovak confirmed quietly. "The real David Morrison was killed in a traffic accident in Toronto 4 years ago. Someone with access to Canadian vital records and passport systems created this false identity using the real Morrison's biographical information. That level of sophistication suggests foreign intelligence services, most likely Soviet or Eastern Bloc. We need to detain him and conduct a full interrogation." The agents entered the waiting area with Sarah accompanying them. Morrison looked up as they approached, and Sarah saw him tense almost imperceptibly, his body preparing for action even as his face remained carefully neutral. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Special Agent Drovak with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," Drovak said, displaying his credentials. "We need to ask you some questions about your identity and travel. You're not under arrest at this time, but we would like you to accompany us to our field office for an interview." Morrison stood slowly, his hands visible, making no sudden movements. "Am I free to leave?" he asked, his voice steady. "No, sir. You're being detained for questioning regarding fraudulent documentation and possible immigration violations. You have the right to remain silent and to consult with an attorney." What followed was a carefully choreographed procedure. Morrison was searched, revealing no weapons, but uncovering several additional items of interest. His wallet contained 3 different credit cards issued under 3 different names. His briefcase held not only the technical manual he had been reading, but also a small notebook filled with handwritten notes in what appeared to be coded notations. Most significantly, sewn into the lining of his overnight bag, agents found a second passport, this one issued by East Germany under the name Klaus Richter. Morrison said nothing during the search, invoking his right to silence and requesting an attorney. He was transported to the FBI field office in Buffalo, while Sarah provided a detailed statement about what had prompted her to send Morrison to secondary inspection and request FBI verification. Agent Drovak told her that her observations and instincts had likely prevented a Soviet intelligence officer from completing whatever mission had brought him across the border. Over the following weeks, Sarah learned fragments of what the FBI investigation uncovered. The man calling himself David Morrison was actually Sergei Volkov, a colonel in the KGB's first chief directorate responsible for foreign intelligence operations. He had been operating in North America for approximately 6 years, initially entering Canada through a complex insertion process that involved multiple false identities and extensive preparation. His primary mission involved serving as a courier and coordinator for a network of Soviet agents operating in the northeastern United States, facilitating communication between operatives and handling the transmission of intelligence materials that were too sensitive to risk through electronic channels. The trips to Syracuse that Morrison had described as business consultations were actually meetings with American citizens who had been recruited as Soviet sources. Some were motivated by ideology, believing they served a greater cause. Others had been compromised through blackmail or financial inducements. All of them were gathering classified information from their positions in defense contractors, government agencies, and research institutions, passing that information to Volkov, who would then route it through secure channels back to Moscow. The FBI's counterintelligence division had been aware that Soviet intelligence was running operations in the region, but they had not identified Volkov or the extent of his network. Sarah's routine border check, her attention to details that most officers would have overlooked, had provided the breakthrough that allowed investigators to roll up the network. Volkov, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of spending decades in an American prison, eventually agreed to cooperate with authorities, providing information about his handlers, his sources, and the broader structure of Soviet intelligence operations in North America. The case remained classified for years, both to protect ongoing investigations and to avoid alerting the Soviet Tsar Union to the full extent of what American counterintelligence had learned. Sarah received a commendation from the FB director, a letter that acknowledged her crucial role in identifying and detaining a foreign intelligence officer, while noting that the details of the case could not be publicly discussed. The commendation was classified at the secret level and remained in her personnel file, rather than being suitable for display or discussion outside secure facilities. Life at the Peace Bridge crossing returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after Sarah Bennett understood how consequential a routine interaction could become. She continued processing vehicles, asking standard questions, checking documents, and waving through the vast majority of travelers who posed no security concerns. But she remained alert in ways that most of her colleagues were not, attuned to the possibility that extraordinary threats could hide behind ordinary facades, that the Cold War being fought in distant places could also reach across her inspection booth on a November morning. Her father, Robert Bennett, retired from the FBI shortly after the Volkov case concluded. Over dinner one evening, he told Sarah that he was proud of her, that she had demonstrated the kind of instinct and judgment that could not be taught, only cultivated through experience and attention to detail. He explained that most intelligence work was exactly like what she had done, noticing small anomalies, trusting instincts when patterns did not align, taking action despite uncertainty and the risk of being wrong. The real skill, Robert said, is not in catching the obvious threats. Those get caught eventually by systems and procedures. The real skill is in recognizing the sophisticated ones, the operatives who have studied their covers so thoroughly that they can pass 99 inspections without raising any concerns. You caught someone who was very good at his job because you were very good at yours. Sarah thought about this frequently in the years that followed. She thought about Sergei Volkov, about the years of training and preparation that had gone into creating his false identity, about the care with which he had maintained his cover while conducting espionage operations against the United States. She thought about how close he had come to successfully crossing the border that morning, how easily she might have waved him through, as thousands of other customs officers would have done, how different the outcome might have been if she had not trusted the instinct that something was wrong. The Honda Accord that Volkov had been driving was eventually traced to a rental agency in Toronto that had been unwittingly providing vehicles to Soviet intelligence through a front company. The technical manual he had been reading was legitimate, part of his cover as a manufacturing consultant, but the notebook contained encrypted communications protocols and contact procedures for meeting with his American sources. The second passport hidden in his luggage was part of an escape plan, documentation that would have allowed him to flee to East Germany if his cover was compromised and he needed to exfiltrate quickly through European connections. Most significantly, the investigation that followed Volkov's arrest led to the identification of 11 American citizens who had been providing classified information to Soviet intelligence. 3 worked for defense contractors producing electronic warfare systems. 2 were employed by the National Security Agency with access to signals intelligence. 4 held positions in the State Department with knowledge of diplomatic negotiations and policy deliberations. 1 was a physicist at a Department of Energy laboratory working on nuclear weapons research. The final source was a congressional staffer with access to classified briefings on military appropriations. Each of these individuals was arrested, prosecuted, and convicted of espionage. The combined damage they had caused over years of cooperation with Soviet intelligence was estimated to have compromised American military capabilities, endangered intelligence operations, and potentially cost lives by revealing information that reached adversaries. Volkov's detention had not merely caught one spy. It had dismantled an entire network and stopped the hemorrhaging of secrets that might have continued for years if he had successfully crossed the border that November morning. Sarah Bennett never met any of the Americans who had betrayed their country by working with Volkov. She never learned all the details of what information they had provided or what operations had been compromised. Much of that remained classified, known only to counterintelligence specialists and senior officials who dealt with damage assessment. But she understood that her decision to trust her instincts, to delay one traveler whose documentation seemed slightly wrong, had initiated a chain of events that protected national security in ways both measurable and incalculable. The Cold War continued for another 7 years after Volkov's arrest, finally ending with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. By then, Sarah had been promoted to supervisory customs officer, training new inspectors in the techniques and procedures that protected American borders. She always emphasized to trainees that their role extended beyond catching smugglers and enforcing import regulations. They were also the first line of defense against more sophisticated threats, the frontline observers who might encounter foreign intelligence operatives attempting to move across the border under false pretenses. Pay attention to the details that do not fit, she would tell them. A passport that looks too new, a travel history that seems too limited, behavior that seems rehearsed rather than natural. Trust your instincts when something feels wrong, even if you cannot immediately articulate what concerns you. The worst outcome is that you delay someone unnecessarily and later feel foolish. The best outcome is that you prevent something significant. Some trainees listened carefully, understanding that they carried responsibilities beyond what their job descriptions made explicit. Others nodded politely and then returned to the routine processing that consumed most of their working hours. Sarah could not blame them. The statistical likelihood of encountering a foreign intelligence operative remained extremely low, and most customs officers would complete entire careers without ever facing such a situation. But the possibility existed, and vigilance mattered precisely because the threats were rare but consequential. In 1995, after the Cold War had ended and many intelligence records were being declassified, a book about Soviet espionage operations in North America included a chapter about networks operating through the Canadian border. Sarah recognized her case in the heavily sanitized description, though names and specific details had been changed to protect sources and methods. The author, a former CIA analyst, estimated that Soviet intelligence had run dozens of similar courier operations through the U.S.-Canadian border during the 1980s, exploiting the high volume of legitimate traffic to mask intelligence activities. Most of these operations were never detected, the author noted. The operatives were too skilled, their documentation too perfect, their behavior too carefully calibrated to avoid raising suspicions. The few cases where couriers were caught typically resulted from human error, from small mistakes in tradecraft that alert observers noticed and reported. The Bennett case, as it was coded in intelligence files, represented an example of how border security and counterintelligence could successfully intersect when customs officers understood their role in protecting national security. Sarah read that chapter multiple times, processing the magnitude of what had been happening while she stood in her inspection booth processing vehicles. The border she had thought of primarily in terms of customs enforcement and immigration control had also been a contested frontier in an intelligence war, a space where both sides maneuvered for advantage while trying to avoid detection. She had been a participant in that conflict, perhaps the most important participant in one specific operation, even though her contribution had come not from any specialized counterintelligence training, but simply from doing her job with exceptional attention to detail. Sergei Volkov served 8 years in federal prison before being exchanged in 1990 for American intelligence officers held by the Soviet Union. He returned to Moscow shortly before the Soviet Union's collapse. His career in foreign intelligence effectively ended by his capture. Sarah never learned what happened to him after that. Whether he received a hero's welcome or faced recriminations for his operational failure, she occasionally wondered if he ever thought about the customs officer whose suspicions had unraveled years of careful preparation, whether he analyzed what small detail had given him away, and how he might have avoided detection. Sarah Bennett retired from U.S. Customs in 2010 after 36 years of service. Her career had been distinguished, but monodramatic, marked by competence and professionalism rather than headline-generating cases. The Volkov detention remained the most significant incident in her service record, though it was noted only in classified portions of her file that few people ever accessed. She had caught other smugglers, identified other fraudulent documents, prevented other violations of law and policy. But nothing else she did in 3.5 decades approached the national security significance of that November morning in 1982, when she trusted her instincts and detained a man whose passport seemed slightly too clean. In retirement, Sarah occasionally spoke to groups of customs and border protection officers about her career and the importance of vigilance. She would tell the story of Sergei Volkov, now declassified enough to discuss in general terms, as an example of how attention to detail could have consequences far beyond what seemed apparent in the moment. She emphasized that she had not been trying to catch a spy that morning, had not been conducting sophisticated counterintelligence work. She had simply noticed that something felt wrong and had taken appropriate action by requesting additional verification. "That is what vigilance really means," she would say. "Not living in constant paranoia, not seeing threats everywhere, but remaining alert to anomalies and trusting trained instincts when patterns do not align with expectations. Most of the time, those anomalies will turn out to be nothing significant, but occasionally, rarely, they will turn out to be exactly what we need to find." The blue Honda Accord that Volkov had been driving was eventually sold at government auction, its intelligence significance lost on the family that purchased it for $3,800 in 1984. The Peace Bridge continued processing millions of vehicles annually, the vast majority of them carrying legitimate travelers and goods between friendly nations. The border remained open, facilitating commerce and connection, while also requiring vigilance against those who would exploit that openness for hostile purposes. Sarah died in 2018 at the age of 70. Her obituary mentioned her career with U.S. Customs, but did not reference the Volkov case, which remained sensitive even decades after the Cold War's conclusion. Her father's FBI commendation letter and her own letter from the FBI director were found among her papers, stored in a safe deposit box along with other important documents from her life. Her family donated them to the National Cryptologic Museum, where they reside in archives documenting civilian contributions to American intelligence and counterintelligence operations. The story of how a routine border check exposed a deep-cover Soviet agent remains a case study in law enforcement and intelligence training programs. It demonstrates the importance of frontline observation, the value of trusting professional instincts, and the reality that significant threats can present themselves in seemingly mundane circumstances. Sarah Bennett's contribution to American security came not from extraordinary action or dramatic confrontation, but from ordinary competence applied with exceptional attention, from recognizing that something was wrong and acting on that recognition despite uncertainty. In the final analysis, her legacy is not merely the specific operation she disrupted or the network she helped dismantle. It is the example she provided of citizenship and service, of professionals who understand that their responsibilities extend beyond immediate job descriptions to encompass broader protection of their country and communities. The Cold War produced countless stories of spies and secrets, of elaborate operations and sophisticated tradecraft. But it also produced quieter stories of ordinary people, in ordinary jobs, who made extraordinary contributions simply by being alert, competent, and willing to act when duty required it. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.